Salvete. This is Richard Campbell with the 20th Legion, a living history group which has participated with the Virginia Junior Classical League for approximately the last 10 years, showing up with arms, armor, people, demonstrations, a Roman street scene, and we have participated in a number of discamus. This year, however, being virtual, we have been asked to present presentations, the same sorts of things we would do on the floor, and present them to you so that you may review them and ask questions. Now, you can either send me email at any time, or I will be available during the JCL event itself for questions. Before we get started, however, I would like for you to discard all of your preconceived notions about gladiators. Let's start not with Hollywood, but with the artifacts and the archaeology of gladiators and how we know about them. So please forget about Spartacus, Russell Crowe's Gladiator, Pepsi commercials, world gladiators on television, reality TV. Just forget all of that for now. Okay, let's get to the facts. How do we know about gladiators and who they were? What do we know about their lives? What do you know how popular they were? All of those questions. Well, there happens to be, because it was so popular in the Roman world, a lot of evidence for it, such as amphitheaters, mosaics and reliefs, armor finds, artifact and toy finds, toys, yes, toys, graffiti, burials, physical bones, and the literary evidence actually from eyewitnesses to the games themselves. You can see a couple examples of the graffiti over on the right. How did the gladiatorial games get started? Well, there is traditions going back way, way before the birth of Rome for human sacrifice among pagan communities and the people of the time. You can see in this illustration here, Achilles, who is sacrificing a Trojan prisoner to the gods. This is actually an Etruscan painting because no one knows if Achilles actually existed or not. But it was the idea that you sacrifice to the gods. And the Etruscans didn't seem to have a particular problem with this, but the Romans did. The Romans, as far as we could tell, never liked the idea of human sacrifice. It was a thing of last resort, but they knew that the gods had to be appeased in that sort of quid pro quo that was typical of Roman religions. So the gladiator combats were fought and blood was spilled in the arena, but is it acceptable to Romans because it was down there, that it was apart from what Rome did, and did it take the moral responsibility off of the Romans? The Etruscan origins of gladiatorial combat are a little murky. The Etruscans greatly influenced Romans culturally, as well as the Greeks, but the Etruscans were right next door. I mean, basically on the other side of the Tiber. And they had many types of rituals and many types of things that happened. The toga may have been originally Etruscan. The Etruscans may have owned a part of Rome, like the Cælian Hills. So they were all over. But the origin of gladiatorial combat may have started with the Etruscans. As you can see in these tomb paintings from the Etruscans, that they appear to be two fighters, appear to be going at it probably to the death. And one of the things, you can see a goddess griffin over on the left. And in the right picture, you have a picture of Charon. And the Charon shows up later in many Roman gladiatorial games. No gladiatorial games without gladiators. So who became a gladiator and who got stuck with it? In the Republican times, it appears that prisoners of war, the actual people that the Romans had conquered, like Samnites, Thracians, and Gauls, were thrown into the arenas or into the funeral games and made to fight each other, with the loser, of course, dying, shedding blood for the departed, the dis manibus, the spirits and of the dead, and the living person can go on to be, live. Could be slaves too. They forced them to fight to the death. Either both go or one of them goes. We're not sure how that worked. It became more and more popular as Republican times went on. In the imperial times, however, things had changed. It had been so popular that they still used slaves in large numbers. They used prisoners of war. But they were starting to it was so popular and so lucrative for the gladiators who survived that volunteers from all social classes started to show up, and something that is no one's quite sure about, they had perhaps undesirables, as you mentioned in Tacitus. Italian towns vied with one another in holding out financial inducements to undesirables among the younger generation, whatever that might be, but they might form the equivalent of teams for each city. But why would someone become a gladiator? They were induced because of the money. Well, first off, the slaves were forced. It's either do that or die. But once you become a gladiator, they might not be actual gladiators, but once you are a gladiator, you start to accumulate money. And successful gladiators became very famous and got all kinds of extra money. But the implications of it is that you are still at the lowest of the social classes. You are a slave, sometimes perhaps even worse than a slave because you're associated with death and sacrifices, which is still kind of bad in the Roman religions. You become a slave to the group's owner, which is to say the ludus, the fighting school, under contract, and you're paid for that. And it's either that, and you fulfill your contract for life, or death, or until freedom. Early Republican gladiators, the first organized in recorded games, were 264 BCE, when the sons of one of the Junii and the Brutuses, who show up much later, as you remember, under Shakespeare and under the Civil Wars, organized a event for their father. And these are funeral games, munera. Early gladiators fought at the funeral games as offerings to the spirit of the departed. You'll notice over on the right that these early ones, they're wearing a lot of body armor. They're wearing scale or mail armor, helmets, shields, and straight swords. The shields may be different types. They might have slightly different equipment to look like the enemies of Rome, but you can see their faces and identify who they are. The funeral games under the Republic became more and more popular and became a little bit more than just death. They were still in favor of, or held in the recognition of someone who had departed, but lots of people showed up. In fact, so many people showed up that when they'd started out in small areas around the forum, they started to make wooden stadiums for them because they were so popular. Politicians, since the patricians in ancient Rome were being elected to various levels of office, and to do that, you had to get people to vote for you. And a great way to do that was to stage games and pay for them. The more elaborate games, the more people were likely to vote for you. You have to then study what it was like, the voting systems under the Republic. Gladiators tended to look like the real enemies of Rome, and their equipment was varied to look like that, whether they were Samnites, Thracians, or Gauls. And the idea was that Romans getting into all these foreign wars, they wanted to get people familiar with the costumes and the armor and the fighting styles of the various ones. But then after the Civil Wars, the Republic is gone. Imperial Rome and the emperors ruled the world. It became a sort of a propaganda sort of thing. So you have amphitheaters that were then developed that split the world into Rome and non-Rome. Everybody who is Roman is up in the stands. You are part of the winning elite. Rome dominates, everyone and every animal that Rome dominates is down there on the amphitheater floor. Their life is subject to the will of Rome. Gladiators under the emperors evolved, standardized, and were abstracted to no longer look like actual enemies who had actually become Roman citizens, like the Samnites. After the social wars of 79 BCE, they were suddenly Roman citizens, and so you can't be killing Roman citizens down on the floor. That didn't sound good. It became true theater. Not only people get bored with just fights, there had to be more. You had to constantly be upgrading what it was you were providing to the population. It helped keep the mass of unemployed out of trouble. Bread and circuses, it said, in addition to the grain doles that were given out to all free citizens in Rome itself, there were free games. And the more elaborate games, the more these people were happy. They were kept off the street. They were entertained, and they weren't bored. However, the emperor controlled the games at this point, and they was out of the hands of the private senators and private patricians who might be seen to be getting too much power. While we don't know much about what a typical Republican-era games day was like. We do know pretty much what the imperial games were like. And this is sort of typical of what would happen. They all day long. Early morning would be the sort of mass events, beast hunts, or venators and bestiarii out there with all the animals from across the empire. Executions of criminals, usually via animals. That got pretty gory. And then at that point, people then felt like they needed to go to snacks, so that lunchtime they'd have a break from the blood. And so they had lunchtime dancing or athletic competitions, and then they would reset the auditorium for the evening or the afternoon work. In the afternoon were the main events of the gladiatorial combats. This is where you might have large group battles where they might depict a battle of history, sort of make it up. You'd start to have scenery would start to show up. There would usually be condemned criminals who are not true gladiators, who, if they are left the last ones standing, might actually get a freedom or a pardon, or at least allowed to run to the other side of the world. Then, at the very end, you have your professional gladiators, the ones everybody is showing up to see, the stars, those with big names. You've heard about them, and they have really great fighting styles. You might actually learn something they say. At that point, then, you've got music, because there are now water organs introduced during the imperial period, trumpets, all kinds of things. And then you have stage props, which is where you'll start to see what happens with the more elaborate amphitheaters. The beast hunts involved all kinds of animals across the Roman Empire, and they had specialized fighters just to handle beasts. It was not just, they could handle any type of spear, nets, anything required. The whole system of bringing animals to Rome or to the amphitheaters around the empire was a very lucrative and a very big business with many people working on it, when they'd have specialists go out and find animals from all the conquered territories. So you no longer have just bears, boars running around the auditorium, the things that Romans might see there in wolves, those they might see in Italy along the Apennines. But you start to get lions, you get elephants, you get giraffes, ostriches, crocodiles, all the way from Africa, Egypt, Britain. They might have brought in aurochs, anything that they could bring in and use there in the amphitheater to show that Rome had conquered all of these territories. Next, let's go to the main types of gladiators that you're usually going to see in the amphitheaters during the imperial period. This isn't all of them, but is the ones that you would most likely see. This first one is a Thrax or Thracian, modeled after the warriors in the region north of Greece. Notice that he has a fully enclosed helmet, a short but curved sword, which is very unique to that period and of that area around north of Greece, Dacia, in that area, Thrace. He has greaves on both legs that go up above the knee. That's an important point to note. He has a manica arm guard, probably not leather, but either padded or cloth or metal, medium-sized shield. Here are actual artifacts from Pompeii, from the training grounds for the gladiators. 2 heavy greaves. It's possible that these were just done for parade or fancy dress purposes, but maybe not. The helmets is definitely a combat helmet, probably saw helmet. You can see it's got tears and rips about it. See that it elaborates. The entire face is enclosed. The throat is guarded. The ears are guarded. You can see out, but nobody can really stick a sword through you. This one is the Hoplomachus, the poor fellow who's down on his knees with the knife at his back. He is similar in many ways to a Thrax. The helmets look alike. He too has a manica, a small shield, but he has a straight sword and a tall, plain helmet with feathers. They always seem to have feathers on them. This one has a griffin, but they may or may not have had the griffins on them. The retiarius, or fisherman, is one of the most recognizable of all the gladiator types, and also the one with almost no armor whatsoever. The retiarius is equipped with only a little arm guard, a little shoulder guard, and a manica, but his main weapons, instead of a sword or a spear, are a net and a trident, which is typical for someone who's supposed to be like a fisherman. He has just his loincloth. He has no greaves, and all he depends on is speed. If you notice in the drawing, he throws the net, which is considered by some to be the primary weapon, against his opponent to try and tangle him up so that he can move around him and get him with his spear. And these are actual galerae from Pompeii, found in the gladiators' barracks. You can see that one of them is kind of plain and the other one is a little more decorated. That's all they did. They just prevented a spear or a knife from going directly into your head. You're able to shove it up. But it's really unfortunate. He does no other armor, no shield, nothing else. So a retiarius has a very minimal of equipment and will depend on speed. Another well-armored gladiator is the provocateur. Now, the provocateur, who is the one standing, looks similar to some of the others, but notice that he has a breastplate on, a little bit of extra armor to protect himself. He has a cuirass, that's really referred to as a cuirass. He has short greaves on him. Notice that they do not go. They only go halfway up his shins. They don't cover the kneecap. He has a standard short sword, which you don't see. You see standing on it, and a regular shield. This is a provocateur's helmet from Pompeii. You notice it is actually very elaborate. It has multiple pieces to it. It's well decorated. You can tell this one's been through the wars. Look at all the beat up pieces of metal, the protection plates on it. It has been seen a lot of use. And you can see that in this one too, everything is protected. They especially take note, it has a very large neck guard on it, which is very similar to Roman military helmets of this time period. It has a brow guard, which is that band that runs horizontally right above the eyes. That too is a feature of Roman military helmets. But he has those odd eye protection grates over him and covers up his ears. This is a very interesting helmet. Always lots of embossing or repoussé on the helmets. The Romans put a lot of money and effort into the decoration of these helmets. A very interesting gladiator is the one called the secutor, who is the one on the right. He looks a lot like the other gladiators. He has a manica arm guard, short sword, a large shield about the size of a Roman infantry shield, and greaves. But the helmet is extremely unique. It is restrictive. He cannot really hear. He cannot really breathe. He can only see out through those two little holes straight forward. This is part of those handicaps that I mentioned earlier in terms of pairing. They would not put two secutors against each other, but against someone like a retiarius, which was actually one of the most famous pairings and the most common, retiarius versus secutor. This is an actual secutor helmet from Pompeii. You'll notice that, yes, indeed, you can only see out through two little holes. The ears are covered, the mouth is covered, but unlike the other ones, the other helmets, notice how far back it slopes. Partially, this is designed to deflect the trident from the retiarius, but it has the effect of really going up against your nose. If the retiarius hits you right in the face, right between the eyes with that trident, he's going to break your nose. And this is one of the problems of the secutor. Notice also that it is very hard to breathe. There is no breathing holes. So if you're panting real hard, this helmet is a real drawback. That's part of the handicap of the type. While the murmillo is derived from the word fish, he really doesn't look much like a fish. He looks a lot like the other gladiators. Notice that the helmets, although they vary slightly, still has the same thing. It has full face covering, mostly covers the throat, covers the ears, covers the head, and covers the eyes so that you cannot punch something right through that little grid that he's got. He has a full-size infantry shield. Differently, he has only one greave, and that's so he stands with his left leg forward, and he's going to be right-handed with his sword, which is a typical 22-inch Roman infantry sword called a gladius. These are some finds of a murmillo and found at the Quattro Porticus at Pompeii outside the gladiator barracks. The two greaves, you see that they are short. They fit right over the arch of your foot, and they go up about halfway. Presumably the shield covered right to that point. The helmet, you can see, looks a lot like the others. It's mainly the same features. It hides the face, but gives better visibility, except for the side, although that is kind of a sunshade, which we'll get to shortly. For a real special treat for the games, the organizers will provide eques. This is going to be more expensive because each have to have a trained horse. They are alone among the gladiators by actually having a full tunic on. They carry lances and longer swords with cavalry-length swords about 30 inches long. They would have both arm and thigh protection. They have a small round shield or a parma, and they have a helmet with plumes and face guard, very similar to everybody else's, but a little simpler. They have no saddles and no stirrups. Now, the Romans did not have stirrups. That fact was not introduced to Europe until about 600 CE. But then they had no saddles. Now, the Romans at this time period did have saddles. They were 4 pommel saddles, and it was actually the Roman cavalry used them extensively, but I guess the point being that you could knock someone off. A Roman cavalry saddle, it's hard to knock someone off. The little pommels, which are little fingers that stick up at all 4 corners, sort of keep you back in your saddle. So that gave you some idea. I think they say that if one of them got knocked off, the other one then had to get off his horse, and then they would go at it foot on foot using their sabers. Pairings of gladiators, as I'd mentioned, in the early Republic, gladiators seemed to be equally equipped, or it was sort of at random who got paired with whom. In the imperial reforms, they realized it was a better show, if that's the word for it, to put up gladiators that had both pluses and minuses to their equipment and their strategies. For example, the most common of which was the famous pairing of the retiarius versus the secutor. As you may remember, the retiarius is lightly armed, has no sword, but has a spear trident and a net. Those are his big deals. The secutor has a full-size shield, an arm guard, a short sword, but a helmet that is completely encloses his head, no breathing holes, and only 2 small holes to look out of. So think again what actually is happening. In the Mediterranean world around Rome in the middle of summer, it gets really hot. It's very, very sunny. It is harsh and it is very dry. The secutor, or hunter as you would say, has heavy armor. I say heavy because that really drags down on you after a few minutes. You're wearing a closed helmet and it's stifling and you can only see forward. 2 heavy greaves and a manica. Now you have to think what the sun feels like on that bronze or steel helmet. Let me tell you, it gets hot really fast. Within a few minutes, you're going to be sweating like crazy. If he doesn't have good eyesight or if he can't breathe, he's going to really suffer from his performance and you can't run real fast. The retiarius has almost no clothing armor, is very lightweight, and can move very quickly. The trident and net don't weigh very much. So the problem is that the retiarius could wear the secutor down before the secutor can get close. The retiarius and the secutor must always keep the retiarius in his vision. So he's always turning his head, always having to turn his body. The retiarius, he doesn't dare let the retiarius come in behind him, escape his vision, because then he's a dead man. So the retiarius knows that he has to keep moving. The secutor knows he has to close quickly. So he must be aggressive. The retiarius then tries to dance out of his way and move quickly. The secutor follows him constantly. There's only so much time under the hot sun that both of them be able to stand this. So how did amphitheaters come to be? The first combats were at funerals, so they're kind of small just for the people attending the funeral, and the gladiators would fight to whatever consequence they wanted, whether there was blood, they were dead, or they shed blood over in favor of the spirits of the departed. They could be open areas outside the city limits. They might be held afterwards in the Forum, which was the great meeting place of Rome, or as they became more popular and more citizens who were standing around decided to watch, they could have big crowds, they started to put up wooden structures. To put the expense of the wooden structures in, it's far when the politicians got involved, because they realized that they made people happy, that they were watching these things, and they realized, they let everybody know that they paid for the stands, they might be more likely to get votes from these people. The wooden structures also that were built at that time were built as temporary stands. They weren't built with a lot of expense. They, however, tended to get really large, and with a lot of people up there stamping their feet, they tended to collapse. It's very well noted in the literature that they collapsed several times with hundreds or thousands of people allegedly being killed in such collapses. The design of the theaters themselves took after, the Greeks were influencing Rome very heavily at this point, and the idea of Greek theaters with their half circle, semicircle was very popular. And the Roman gladiator organizers realized this was a very good thing. Everybody could see, but they didn't need the backdrop of the theater, so they just doubled the size of the amphitheater. They doubled a Greek theater and turned it into a Roman amphitheater, which is to say, double theater. The first permanent purpose-built amphitheater was in Pompeii, constructed around 70 BCE. It's one built in stone and built into the side of the hill. It took advantage of the geography, and it wasn't going to collapse. These further evolved over time as they became popular, and politicians were trying to upstage one another, into staged theater, where they'd have stage props and other things going on where people were more comfortable. Became longer and longer entertainment. It was at first just pairs of gladiators, and then it got to be more types of gladiators, and then it got to be foreign sets and foreign lands representing those that Rome conquered. And then, because it's so hot, they kind of the invention of a sun umbrella, or otherwise called the Valeria. How many amphitheaters were there? There were hundreds of them. You can see on this map that they stretched everywhere from Britain to the Middle East, all the way across Northern Europe, all across Africa, Spain, all across Turkey, in Greece, everywhere. Very popular, and we have not found them all yet. They're even poke into places in Germany, right along the border. Probably the German barbarians came and took a look at them too. There might even be a ludus, a gladiator training ground on the far side of the Rhine. Here is the amphitheater at Pompeii. You can see that it's still in pretty good shape because it was buried by the eruption, although some of the stone has been removed by locals who are building their own houses with it. But it is still there. You see that it has a very solid floor to it. It is nothing underneath it. It's just dirt. It was built into the side of the hill to help with construction costs and keep them down. You can see in the right that it has a series of tunnels going through it, which led to stairways going up into the various seating areas. In this case, the one you see there on the right goes up to the patricians and higher social status people seating area, which is right next to the arena itself, which is a good point. You should notice that same as in Roman theaters versus Greek theaters, the Romans make a social distinction by putting a barrier. In this case, you can see that small wall between the first seats closest to the amphitheater and everybody up above them. Very Roman way, very typical. That's how you tell a Greek theater from a Roman theater. They have that wall. They all do. Very important to Rome was the social status, and your social status of how close you could get to the action down there. A view of the amphitheater at Pompeii from the floor. Here you can see that there are doorways up at the top. Yes, the people who weren't the patricians had to walk up the steps and enter from the top and then come down. And you see there's just a single corridor where the people who are worth something, the hot top people of the town, just walked a small corridor, walked up a short set of steps, and voila, there are their seats. About 140 years later, amphitheaters had evolved to something that was far more artistic, far more spectacular. This is the amphitheater at Pozzuoli, and you can still see they still have seating areas that have survived, but the major point in Pozzuoli is what's underground. You see all those light hatches, little doorway, little grates all over the floor. Well, guess what? We're going to go take a look at that underneath. One thing to notice also, if you noticed in Pompeii, the walls were solid all the way around the amphitheater. If you look a little to the left, you will see a doorway in the wall right next to a collapsed section of seating. That leads to a series of steps that go right down to the bottom floor. And this is what you see under the arena floor at Pozzuoli. you can see that there's really, really extensive infrastructure down here with vaults, cubby holes, cages, storage areas, lift points, everything that supports the grand theater that's going on above them. You can see it's in very good shape, so it's really worth a visit if you ever get a chance. If you look at the image on the right, you'll see these little knobs sticking out of the wall, and those are anchor points for lifts and stairways and other types of devices that allowed you to manage the flow of animals and people and stage props during the performances. These two little models are from the Museum of the Colosseum of Rome itself, up on the second floor. You can look carefully, you'll see how elaborate. There are winches, there are cages, there are levers, there are ramps, or the hinted ramps for and lots of ropes for moving props and furniture, and dropping ramps, raising ramps, dropping the floor so something can pop out of the floor. Very elaborate. And it is it takes a lot more people to run something like this than it did when it was just a plain floor. So now you've really got a very elaborate organization, stage managers, animal handlers, people that can handle ropes, all sorts of things. So what went on underneath the Colosseum was really remarkable. And this is the bottom on the left, the bottom of the Colosseum in Rome itself, the Flavian Amphitheater. You can see how far it goes. It's a very long corridor. And you can see also on the right how many different corridors, rooms there are all throughout the flooring of the Colosseum. Now, if you look carefully, you will see little holes, little square holes in the walls. That too, these were all anchor points for various types of ramps, lifts, cages to hold things, ways of managing the flow of people going up and animals going up, and stage props going up to the floor itself. They would drop a trap door and up would pop a palm tree. Now, it's just the most amazing thing. Must have been quite a sight to see. For comparison, here is the backstage of a modern opera house. And these things are incredibly complex. If you're sitting in the audience, you see the stage. You don't see anything else, which of course is important. You're not supposed to see anything else. But in a modern opera house, they even have 3 separate stages around the middle stage where entire sets are just shoved all at once to do scene changes. But if you can just look above at the lighting, the ropes, the mechanisms required to make the modern theater magic happen, you can get some idea of what was going on under the Colosseum. Now we have to look at the amphitheater itself. From a side cross view is how it was constructed. Fortunately, the amphitheater in Rome, the Colosseum, and some of the others around the world, in France particularly, are pretty well preserved, so you get a very good idea of how the Romans built them. You notice in this structure, as a side view, that the Roman social stratus is very important. And you see down at the bottom, the first row is just the patricians and the Vestal virgins. The second would be the equites and the less noble class. Above that are the freemen, the plebeians, and above that are the slaves and women. Women were, except for the Vestal virgins, women were not allowed to be down near the arena floor. Over on the right, you can see that the Colosseum still has many passageways fully intact from the ancient world. In the background, you can see one of the steps leading up to one of the upper levels. And also, they are very worn down after being used for 2,000 years, because the Colosseum was a fortress in the medieval period for a while. And it was built mainly of concrete, but concrete and brick. Poured concrete everywhere throughout this one. It's a real marvel of Roman engineering and architecture. This is a sunshade or velarium, which was a major improvement to amphitheaters everywhere, probably also used in the regular theaters. It was an expensive addition for any games and was specifically called out in advertisements that, yes, indeed, there would be sunshades today. You can see the only image of it that we had is from this fresco of the amphitheater of Pompeii. You see in the background that there is a velarium raised above the seating. On the right, you can see how they did it, or at least how we think they did it. This is taken mostly from the Colosseum in Rome. There's evidence for these supports for these vertical bars and for stones at the base that would hold the guy wires. Most people think that the people running this were sailors who already knew rigging and stresses for sails and how to do blocks and that sort of thing. Going back briefly to that fresco of the amphitheater of Pompeii, you may have noticed lots of people running around. Well, it's a very famous depiction of an event that happened in Pompeii some decades before the eruption. There was a riot. Apparently, there were games sponsored between Pompeii and the town of Nuceria. And you might wonder, why would people get upset about gladiators who are paid professionals, whether they rioted or not? Well, do you remember the undesirables who might have been recruited for these? Some of the gladiators, since these teams appear to have been teams from Pompeii and a team from Nuceria, may have involved people that on the ground floor that people actually knew. They might have been related. And perhaps if there was a bad call, the Nucerians went bonkers and started beating up and killing the people from Pompeii. Unfortunately for Pompeii, Nero heard about this. It was so serious that he banned the games in Pompeii for 10 years. This apparently didn't happen, it's not recorded as happening anywhere else in the Roman world. It was quite an event to go to a gladiatorial games, and they didn't leave anything to chance. There were plenty of things to buy, including souvenirs. In fact, much of what we know about gladiators comes from a lot of these souvenirs, especially little 3D figurines. Souvenirs were for all ages. It could be for children all the way up for adults. It could be expensive to inexpensive. There were cups, lamps, clay lamps, figurines in brass and clay. And if you really liked what you'd seen, you would commission mosaics and frescoes to record the events that you saw, kind of like Super Bowl, on your floor for everybody to see for years to come. There was also graffiti. For everybody else, there's graffiti. And if you go throughout Pompeii and Herculaneum, you will find graffiti on almost every wall. It's everywhere. These are examples of two types of glass cups and souvenir cups that you would see. The one on the left is a modern reproduction taken from an original, and it records the gladiators' names on it. Now, you have to think that it must have been prepared weeks in advance to prepare the mold and get enough of these blown and ready, ordered, and in stock so that people could buy them. The one on the right was painted and looks more generic, but it's really pretty. They were found, of course, like grass. They'd broken up, and they have painstakingly put them back together. Very colorful. You can see the brass, the bronze, the colors that were typical of the gladiators. Rome was a very colorful place, and they loved this sort of thing. Both of these, as a matter of fact, were found in Britain, and shows you just how popular it was. Gladiatorial combat, the games were popular everywhere throughout the Roman world. If you could not afford a glass cup, you could afford an oil lamp, something you would use every day and wouldn't feel too bad if it actually broke. There were thousands and thousands of these, and there are many, many different types. You can find them everywhere. Almost every museum throughout Europe has them. There's quite a collection in the museum in the Colosseum itself, which I think these are both from. Very interesting. And you can see in the detail of it, they went into that. You can see on the right, you can see the thrakes. You know, he's got the curved sword, dead giveaway. And on the left, you can see a thrakes and another. They can't quite make out which one it is. But anyway, there are many, many of these. And you could get figurines. Sometimes it would be like to play with. They had movable parts. There's a secutor whose helmet comes up, pops up. You can see the guy underneath him. The one on the left is a thrakes with his zilsica or a falx. Has an animal head on him for some reason. Maybe there was something that went on that was spectacular about that at that particular game. But interestingly enough, he seems to have more armor than the usual thrakes does. The one on the right is a typical secutor. You can see his manica, his helmet. He's probably had a sword that was raised, and it looks like he was holding a shield. And if you had the money and really wanted to show off on a particular event, you would put a permanent reminder of it in your floor. These mosaics are typical of the quality of Roman mosaics. The one on the left must have been an enormous battle, an enormously expensive and notable gladiatorial combat. Everybody's named on it. The results are named. The little theta there means death. Rodan and Astius both seem to have died as a result. Very expensive for the organizers. Somebody paid a lot of money for it. The one on the right, the Retiarius, it looks like Retiarius who's fallen down. That was recently found a year or two ago in Libya. It is probably one of the finest mosaics in the Roman world in terms of quality and expressiveness. This is the best photograph we can find. It is really a very large one. Frescoes are another way for people to show off that they've actually been to a particular event and they want to commemorate a point in time about a particular combat. You can see it. This is most likely people that the owners, not only the owners knew, but all their guests would know too. The one on the right is where the one fellow is beginning to give up here, was excavated recently in Region 5 in Pompeii, and it is in excellent shape. The gladiator on the right has not been killed, but he is signaling that he's giving up. I'm not sure at what point you have to. You see he's got lots of cuts all over him. He's bleeding, probably getting weak under the sun. He has put his right arm, his sword or arm behind him, and he's extending his left arm with his index finger up, which says he's giving up and he's asking for mercy. It is just a very remarkable fresco. And then, if you could not afford frescoes, mosaics, or anything else, you could take some sort of sharp something and write in a wall. This is what people do throughout Pompeii, Herculaneum, Rome, just about anywhere the Romans went, somebody started scratching on the wall. These are very common. Graffiti, I mean, you've got 50,000 people a day going to gladiatorial games. A lot of them want to record it, and they will go off. As they're walking out of the stadium, they would start scratching on the walls what it was that they had seen. This is everywhere throughout Rome. There are entire books, and for example, Washington and Lee, they record the graffiti of everything that's going on in Pompeii and Herculaneum. You can see that also that that most people were actually able to write on the walls. I don't know what percentage of the adult population could, but quite a few could, because they expected not only the people to notice what they had scratched in the wall in terms of the figures, but also they expected people to be able to read it. That was sort of what happened. I don't know what the percentage was, but it was the average person, because the patricians are not going to go around scratching graffiti on the wall. They don't need to do that. It's the plebeians, the common people, that would go off and do that. So what is the life of a gladiator actually like? First off, they're all slaves legally, either under contract or through war, or however they got there. They were captive soldiers. They were recruited from towns and signed up. They were people who had huge debts and got those paid off by joining the gladiatorial groups. Or sometimes they were just free volunteers. It was an extremely exciting life. They could make a lot of money. And they came from the upper levels, the patricians and the senatorial class, even patrician women and equites class women would join. They would join up with a gladiatorial school. You had to get trained someplace. Gladiatorial schools were kind of like barracks. People, the gladiator trainees lived there. They might have been locked in, but in Pompeii, they have found that there are several places where the top gladiators were allowed out and would go and live in the town itself. It gives you an idea that it wasn't necessarily a death sentence to be a gladiator. As they say, only 1 in 20 died in the arena. So a gladiator who's both really good at it and becomes very expensive can expect to last a considerable amount of time until they could either be freed or buy their freedom. They could live, as I say, to be granted freedom. They could marry, although and it's a peculiar arrangement for a slave to marry Under Roman law, you could do that. They could get rich. A gladiator that's paid under the Roman system of slavery owns his money, can spend it as he wishes, but as actually the property of his owner, if he dies, the money goes back to the owner. But if they manage to escape their contract, they take that money with them. So there are women gladiators. This is a funeral relief of two women gladiators, Aquilia and Amazonia. And it's the only relief that's known. I think this one's in the British Museum. And they are reported in the eyewitness accounts of the times, both Tacitus and Juvenal, and Pliny, I believe, also. Tacitus says, many ladies of distinction, however, and senators disgraced themselves by appearing in the amphitheater. It doesn't say whether they had to become slaves or not, but there they were with the lowest of the low. And under Juvenal, what sense of shame to be found in a woman wearing a helmet who shuns femininity and loves brute force? Hear her grunt while she practices thrusts, as shown by the trainer wilting under the weight of the helmet. Really interesting stuff. Contrary to the way it looks in some of the movies, gladiators could get a decent burial with tombstones. There are recently excavated graveyards in Ephesus in Turkey and in UK. You can see here, it looks like a Murmillo. There's his tombstone. So they did get decent burials. They weren't just thrown in pits, which is sort of the implication of the movie Spartacus. What were the gladiatorial schools like? There were quite a few of them. Most famously, there were a lot around the Bay of Naples, which is where the Spartacan revolt started. They would tend to look like the one on the right. That's a model of one that was found in Germany itself. You can see that it has barracks. It may have been kind of a quasi-prison for the people training in it. You can see that it has a training field, and then it has a training auditorium. In this case, you can see a little ring in the center of it that might have been a boundary for combats. You go outside, everything stops, or something like that might happen. No one's really sure. On the left, you can see the remains of the Ludus Magnus, which was the great training ground in Rome itself, right next to the Colosseum. To the left, you can see the remains of the mini amphitheater where they did their training. They might have had demonstrations for rich people that didn't require renting the entire Colosseum. There are barracks you can see in the background, little niches and cubbies for people to live in. So all gladiator novices would be assigned or join a training school. The person who heads it, the lanista, controls all their contracts, and the terms of the contracts are probably more favorable in the terms of the lanista than of the gladiator, except if the gladiator started to actually win and make money and become popular. Despite everything we know about gladiators, it's really hard to say exactly how they fought. There are plenty of depictions of them, and we have some idea of the stages of gladiatorial combat. They were kind of set. They would do something where they would both fight, they would lose their shields, and then they would grapple. This is according to Dr. Steve Tuck of Miami University, Ohio, who had done a lecture on this, and his interpretation is that many of these combats were kind of, well, I don't call them staged, but everybody expected a certain amount of sword fighting, a certain amount of hitting each other, and a certain amount of rolling around on the ground until one of them gave up. So people do try to reenact these. You can see on the left, the Retiarius is really on the losing end of a Murmillo. Actually, it looks like he just gotten killed, or a Secutor, I should say. Secutor is there, has put his blade up against the guy's chest. That would be the end of any Retiarius. On the right is another one, a female Retiarius. It was probably not common to see women matched with men. It was usually women versus women because of the strength differences. At least that's what the evidence tends to show us. But there's nothing to really say that the women couldn't be any faster. It would be a good one for them. But you may remember in the other Juvenal mentioned that women would wear helmets and grunt with greaves and such. So they were not just retiarii, they were all classes of gladiators. These are reenactors from Eastern Europe, where they don't worry so much about legal battles, liabilities, and getting sued, apparently. To close, I'd like to show you 3 books that are really good reference material. The Osprey book on the left on gladiators. It covers this basically the imperial period that we've been talking about. It's an inexpensive book, about $15, and has many illustrations that are taken directly from the actual finds. The book in the center is a more comprehensive book to the fighting and the infrastructure and the psychology of the gladiators, and goes into considerable depth. It's recommended by several academics in the field. The book on the right might be a little harder to find, BBC's Colosseum, done by the famous Roman world illustrator Peter Connolly, who has done a lot of study of the infrastructure under the Colosseum floor itself and shows you many, many illustrations for how the ramps, the lifts, the handling of the animals, the handling of people, stage, props, and everything else were actually done. A very good book if you can find it. I would also like to leave my email with you. If you have any further questions, please feel free to email me or contact me at Facebook. The Legion has a Facebook page, so you can follow up there as well. Oh, and one more thing. If you ever get the chance to see the I, Claudius TV series, there is a speech by the Empress Livia, Augustus's wife, to the gladiators themselves, which I consider to be the greatest locker room speech of all time. I think I will leave you to read that yourselves, but I believe it's probably the opinion of the patricians towards gladiators entirely throughout this period.